The Black family arrived at the grand doors of the luxurious hotel after a long, tiresome journey. The mother held her young daughter's hand, while the father pushed a luggage cart piled high with suitcases. The family's demeanor was calm and composed, though there was a quiet excitement in their eyes, as if this trip marked a special occasion. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the scene. But the atmosphere quickly grew chilly as they approached the reception desk. Behind the polished counter stood an impeccably dressed man with a rigid posture. His name tag read Mr. Patterson, and his face wore a mask of indifference. As the family stepped forward, his expression hardened, and his gaze moved sharply to the father. His eyes lingered a moment too long, and his lips curled ever so slightly in distaste. "Can I help you?" Mr. Patterson asked, his tone clipped. The father, unfazed, nodded politely and said, "We have a reservation under the name Johnson." Mr. Patterson's fingers danced over the keyboard, but his eyes remained fixed on the family. He leaned slightly closer to the screen, his brow furrowing, before standing upright with an exaggerated sigh. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any reservations under that name." The father frowned but remained calm. "Could you check again? We made the reservation weeks ago. My wife even confirmed it with your office yesterday." "I don't think that'll be necessary," Mr. Patterson interrupted, his tone now tinged with impatience. "Even if there was a mistake, we're fully booked tonight. There's nothing I can do." The mother stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "We've traveled a long way, and we've already paid for our stay. Surely there's someone else we can speak to?" Mr. Patterson's smile was icy. "There's no one else, ma'am. I'm in charge of guest services this evening." He added with a faint smirk, "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable finding accommodations elsewhere." The father's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "We'll wait here while you double-check." "This is unacceptable." The lobby began to grow quieter as other guests and staff subtly turned their attention to the escalating tension. Mr. Patterson glanced around, his discomfort evident, but his stubbornness won out. "I've already told you, sir. There's no mistake. You're not on the list." The father exchanged a glance with his wife. Something about this felt deliberate, not just a case of overbooking or an error in the system. Before he could respond, their young daughter tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why can't we go to our room?" The mother knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft but full of determination. "Don't worry, sweetie. We'll figure this out." Meanwhile, a hotel bellhop standing near the luggage carts watched the scene unfold, his face etched with discomfort. He seemed hesitant, as if debating whether to intervene, but ultimately stayed silent. The father stepped closer to the counter, his voice lower but firmer. "You're refusing us service because of who we are, aren't you?" Mr. Patterson stiffened, his smirk fading. "That's a baseless accusation. I'm simply doing my job." The father didn't back down. "Your job is to treat all guests fairly. That's not what's happening here." The tension in the lobby was palpable now, and whispers rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Just then, the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor drew everyone's attention. A sharply dressed woman with an air of authority approached, her eyes scanning the scene. Her name tag read Manager. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone professional but icy. Mr. Patterson immediately straightened. "Just a minor issue with a reservation, ma'am. I was explaining to these guests that we're fully booked." The manager turned to the family, her expression unreadable. The father met her gaze, his voice steady. "We have a confirmed reservation, and this gentleman is refusing to honor it. We believe this treatment is unfair and discriminatory." The manager's eyes flicked to Mr. Patterson, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Is that true?" Before he could respond, the father pulled out his phone and opened an email. "Here's the confirmation, with the hotel's logo and all the details." The manager studied the screen, her face betraying nothing. She turned to Mr. Patterson. "I'll handle this. Please step aside." Mr. Patterson hesitated, his face reddening, but eventually moved away. The manager turned back to the family, her tone softening slightly. "I'll sort this out. If you'll follow me to my office, we can discuss this privately." The family exchanged wary glances but agreed. As they walked toward the office, the father's mind raced. Something about this whole situation felt too orchestrated. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than simple prejudice. Once inside the office, the manager closed the door and gestured for them to sit. "I owe you an apology," she began, her tone measured. "What happened out there was unacceptable." The father folded his arms. "We've heard the apologies before. What are you going to do about it?" The manager paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "There are certain issues within our staff that we've been working to address. I assure you, this is not reflective of our hotel's values." The father's eyes narrowed. "And yet, here we are." The manager leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. "If you're willing to be patient, I'll make sure you're compensated for your trouble." The father stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Compensation isn't the point. We want accountability." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The manager straightened, clearly unsettled. "I'll do everything I can to ensure this doesn't happen again. Please, allow me to make this right." Before the father could respond, his wife placed a hand on his arm. "Let's hear her out," she said quietly. The father leaned back, his gaze still fixed on the manager. "We'll see." The manager's hands trembled slightly as she shuffled some papers on her desk, clearly stalling. Her measured words and calm demeanor couldn't mask the unease behind her eyes. The father noticed this immediately, his instinct sharpening. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on here?" he asked, his tone low but firm. The manager froze, her fingers clutching the edge of a paper as though it might shield her. "I've already explained," she began, but the father wasn't convinced. "You haven't explained anything," he interrupted, his patience thinning. "First, we're told our reservation doesn't exist, then we're refused service at the front desk, and now you're dancing around the issue. Something's not adding up, and I'm not leaving until I get some answers." His wife nodded, her presence adding quiet strength to his words. Even their young daughter, who had been quietly watching the exchange, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her wide eyes darting between the adults. The manager sighed, leaning back in her chair as if the weight of the situation was finally catching up to her. "It's complicated," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The father's eyes narrowed. "Try me." She hesitated, her gaze darting to the door as though checking to ensure no one was eavesdropping. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "There's been pressure from certain investors. They have strong opinions about the kind of clientele we should prioritize." The mother's face tightened, her voice calm but edged with frustration. "You mean they don't want people like us here?" The manager winced, but she didn't deny it. "I don't agree with it," she said quickly, "but I'm not in a position to challenge them directly. If I do, I risk losing my job, and honestly, they've made things difficult for anyone who questions them." The father shook his head, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So you'd rather toe the line than stand up for what's right? That's the problem with people like you. Always playing it safe while others pay the price." The manager looked genuinely pained, but before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Everyone tensed as Mr. Patterson stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His smirk was back, and he seemed oddly emboldened, as though he'd been listening in. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The father stood, his towering presence immediately shifting the dynamic in the room. "We were just about to leave," he said coldly, taking his phone out and snapping a quick picture of Mr. Patterson and the manager. "What do you think you're doing?" Patterson snapped, his confidence faltering. "Documenting this," the father replied smoothly. "Because if this hotel thinks it can get away with treating people like second-class citizens, they're in for a rude awakening." Patterson's face reddened, but the manager quickly intervened. "Let's not escalate this further," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "Oh, this isn't escalating," the father replied, his tone razor-sharp. "It's just beginning." As the family left the office, the tension in the air was palpable. Other staff members watched nervously as they walked back into the lobby, where the crowd from earlier had grown. The father paused in the center of the room, his voice loud enough to carry. "Just so everyone knows," he began, addressing the room, This hotel is refusing to honor our confirmed reservation. And if you're wondering why, take a good look at us and draw your own conclusions." A murmur spread through the crowd as people began whispering to each other. Some looked outraged. Others looked uncomfortable. The family walked out of the hotel into the crisp night air. But the father wasn't done. He pulled out his phone again, this time recording a video as he recounted the events of the evening. "This isn't just about us," he said to the camera. "This is about standing up to discrimination, wherever it happens. And trust me, we'll be standing tall." As the video uploaded to social media, the family piled into their car. The mother turned to her husband, her voice quiet but resolute. "This isn't over." "Not by a long shot," he replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The car ride back was filled with a heavy silence, but beneath it, a storm of determination brewed. The father clenched the steering wheel as his wife stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just unfolded. In the back seat, their daughter fiddled with her stuffed animal, her young eyes wide with confusion and worry. "Are we going to let them get away with it, Daddy?" she asked, breaking the silence. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his jaw tightening. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly. "We're not." By the time they reached home, the video he had uploaded earlier was already gaining traction online. Comments were flooding in, many expressing outrage, some sharing similar experiences, and a few skeptics questioning if the story was real. "Look at this," his wife said, pointing to the screen of her phone. "People are furious. It's spreading like wildfire." "Good," he replied. "But this isn't just about making noise online. We need to act." The father began drafting an official complaint against the hotel, documenting every detail of their interaction. Meanwhile, his wife reached out to a friend who worked as a journalist. Within an hour, they had scheduled an interview to share their story on a local news station. Just as they were wrapping up for the night, the father's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender with the subject line, "You need to know the truth about the hotel." He exchanged a wary glance with his wife before opening it. The message contained a set of documents and a single lie. "These are from someone on the inside who's had enough. Use them wisely." As they scrolled through the files, their eyes widened. It was a treasure trove of information, emails, memos, and financial records. They revealed a systemic effort by certain individuals within the hotel's management to implement discriminatory policies under the guise of business strategy. The documents even included directives from an unnamed board member encouraging staff to turn away undesirable clientele. "This is bigger than just us," his wife said, her voice shaking. "They're targeting entire communities." Before they could fully process the gravity of what they'd uncovered, there was a loud knock at their door. The sound was sharp and urgent, cutting through the stillness of the house. The father hesitated for a moment, exchanging a tense glance with his wife. "Stay with our daughter," he whispered before making his way to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw two figures standing on the porch. One was a man in a suit, his expression stern but professional. The other was Mr. Patterson. The father opened the door slightly, keeping the chain in place. "What do you want?" The man in the suit spoke first, his voice calm but authoritative. "My name is Michael Grant. I'm a legal representative for the hotel. We're here to discuss tonight's incident." "At this hour?" the father shot back. "You expect me to believe this is just a friendly visit?" Mr. Patterson stepped forward, his smirk barely concealed. "We just thought you'd appreciate the chance to resolve this matter quietly," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The father's grip on the door tightened. "Quietly, huh? Sounds like you're worried about the noise we're making." Grant raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, no one wants this to escalate further. Perhaps we can come to an understanding." "An understanding?" the father interrupted, his voice rising. "After everything you put us through, you think we're going to let you sweep this under the rug? You've got some nerve showing up here." Behind him, his wife appeared, her phone in hand. She was recording the entire exchange. Grant's expression faltered as he noticed the camera. "There's no need for that," he said quickly. "Oh, there's every need," she replied. "Because people like you only play fair when the world is watching." Patterson's smug demeanor cracked, and he muttered something under his breath. I suggest you leave, the father said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. We've got all the evidence we need, and trust me, you're not going to like what happens next. The two men exchanged a glance before retreating down the steps. As their car disappeared into the night, the father closed the door and turned to his wife. We're not just fighting for us, he said, his voice resolute. We're fighting for everyone they've wronged. His wife nodded, her determination matching his. Let's make sure they never do this to anyone else again. The battle had only just begun, but they knew one thing for certain. They weren't backing down. The father paced the living room after the men left, his mind racing with possibilities. The hotel's representatives showing up unannounced had rattled him more than he cared to admit. What were they really afraid of? And why now? His wife sat at the dining table, poring over the documents from the anonymous email. There's more here, she murmured, pointing at the screen. Look, these memos aren't just about this location. It's a company-wide strategy. They're profiling people based on zip codes, names, even the cars they drive. The father leaned over her shoulder, scanning the files. This isn't just a local issue. They're discriminating at scale. If we expose this, it could bring the whole company down. But that's exactly why they showed up tonight, she said, her voice tense. They're trying to scare us into staying quiet. As if on cue, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. You think you're clever, don't you? A gravelly voice said. Digging where you don't belong. But let me give you some advice. Drop this now, or you'll regret it. Who is this? The father demanded, his voice sharp. The line went dead. He stared at the phone, his chest tightening. His wife looked up at him, her face pale. What's wrong? Nothing, he said quickly, but the doubt in her eyes mirrored his own. Before they could say anything more, their daughter appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed animal. Mommy, Daddy, she said, her voice small. Why are there people outside? The father rushed to the window, parting the curtains just enough to see. Two cars idled across the street, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. They've sent someone to watch us, his wife whispered, her voice shaking. Let's not jump to conclusions, he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. But as the hours stretched on, the cars didn't move. Every time they checked, the figures inside seemed to shift slightly, their presence an undeniable reminder that they were being watched. The tension in the house grew thick. The father finally decided to call his journalist friend. We need to go public with this now, he said firmly. They're trying to intimidate us, but if we shine a light on this, they won't have anywhere to hide. The journalist agreed, promising to air the story first thing in the morning. But the night was far from over. At around 3 a.m., a loud crash jolted them awake. The father bolted downstairs, his heart racing. The front window was shattered, glass shards scattered across the floor. On the porch lay a brick with a note tied around it. He picked it up, his hands trembling. The note read, Last warning, drop it. His wife joined him, her face pale as she surveyed the damage. This has gone too far, she said. We need to call the police. He hesitated. The irony of relying on law enforcement, given the nature of their fight, wasn't lost on him. But he knew they couldn't handle this alone. When the officers arrived, they took notes but offered little reassurance. We'll keep an eye on things, one of them said, his tone dismissive. Keep an eye on things, the father repeated, his frustration boiling over. We're being harassed, threatened, and now our property is damaged. Is that all you've got to say? The officer shrugged. Without witnesses or evidence of who did this, there's not much we can do. As they left, the father felt a deep sense of helplessness. But his wife placed a hand on his arm. We've come this far, she said. We're not backing down now. The next morning, the news broke. Their story aired on the local station, accompanied by the damning documents. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. People from across the city and beyond shared their own experiences with discrimination at the hotel chain, amplifying the story even further. But as the family watched the coverage, they couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Exposing them is just the beginning, the father said. Now we have to make sure they face real consequences. The father paced back and forth, his mind racing as he watched the news coverage unfold. The anonymous emails, the threatening phone calls, the shattered window. They had faced all of it to expose the truth. Yet, something gnawed at him. Why hadn't there been a response from the hotel's corporate office? No denials, no statements, no damage control. It was too quiet. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was the journalist. "I just got tipped off," the voice said urgently. "The hotel's legal team is filing a defamation lawsuit against you and your family." "What?" The father's voice rose. "They're claiming the documents are fabricated and that you're slandering their name to extort money. They're coming after you hard. This is their way of fighting back." The father gripped the phone tightly. "We have the truth on our side. Let them try." But as soon as he hung up, the weight of the situation hit him. A legal battle could drain them financially and emotionally. They had exposed the truth, but at what cost? The family gathered in the living room, the atmosphere tense. "We knew they'd retaliate," his wife said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But we can't let them win. Not after everything we've been through." "She's right," their son added. "We're not just fighting for us. We're fighting for everyone who's been wronged by them." The father nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we fight back. Harder." The next day, the father and his wife reached out to every contact they had: civil rights organizations, community leaders, and legal experts. They mobilized a wave of support, turning the lawsuit into a public battleground. Soon, rallies were held outside the hotel chain's properties, with people demanding accountability. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for boycotts, and former employees came forward with their own stories of the company's discriminatory practices. But the hotel chain wasn't backing down. They hired private investigators to dig into the family's past, searching for anything they could use to discredit them. One evening, while the father was reviewing the latest updates with their lawyer, his son burst into the room, holding his laptop. "Dad, look at this." On the screen was a leaked internal memo from the hotel's corporate office. It outlined a coordinated effort to smear the family's reputation, including instructions to plant false information about them in the media. "This is it," the father said, his voice tinged with both anger and triumph. "This is the proof we needed to show just how far they're willing to go." But as they prepared to release the memo, a car screeched to a halt outside their home. The father looked out the window to see two men in suits approaching the door. He opened it cautiously. One of the men handed him an envelope. "You've been served," he said coldly before walking away. The father opened the envelope, his hands shaking. It was an injunction, barring them from releasing any further information about the hotel chain until the lawsuit was resolved. "This is their last-ditch effort to silence us," his wife said, reading over his shoulder. "But they can't stop the truth from coming out." Their lawyer arrived shortly after, and they strategized late into the night. The injunction was a setback, but they had other ways to keep the momentum going. The family decided to hold a press conference, inviting all the media outlets that had been following the story. They couldn't release the memo directly, but they could speak about the broader pattern of intimidation and harassment they had faced. As the press conference began, the father stood in front of the cameras, his voice steady but passionate. "This isn't just about one family," he said. "This is about a system that thinks it can bully and silence anyone who challenges it. But we won't be silenced." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the family looked out at the sea of supportive faces, they felt a renewed sense of hope. But the fight wasn't over yet. They knew the hotel chain had deeper resources and a ruthless determination to crush them. And somewhere in the back of the father's mind, a nagging question lingered. Just how far would they go to protect their secrets? As the press conference ended, the father couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. The hotel chain's silence during the event felt ominous, as if they were regrouping for a heavier blow. That night, he sat in his dimly lit office, scrolling through emails and updates from their supporters. His eyes lingered on one particular message, sent from an anonymous address. "You don't know who you're messing with. Stop now, or your family pays the price." His heart raced as he read the threat. It was vague, but chillingly clear. He immediately forwarded the email to their lawyer and the authorities, but he knew better than to expect swift action. The next morning, as the family was heading out for a community rally, the father noticed something strange. A black SUV had been parked across the street for hours, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. He glanced at it several times, but it didn't move. At the rally, the family received overwhelming support. People waved signs demanding justice, and chants filled the air. Yet, as he gave a speech to the crowd, the father couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes scanned the faces in the audience, lingering on a man with sunglasses and a baseball cap who seemed to be taking notes rather than chanting along. After the rally, their lawyer pulled him aside. "I've been digging," she said in a hushed tone. "The hotel chain's ties go deeper than we thought. Their board of directors includes several high-profile individuals who won't want this scandal to blow up. They're connected to politicians, law enforcement, even media outlets. If we're going to win, we need to be strategic." The father clenched his fists. "We've already put everything on the line. We're not backing down now." That night, as the family prepared for bed, the power in their house suddenly went out. The streetlights outside flickered briefly before plunging into darkness. The father grabbed a flashlight and headed to the circuit breaker, his nerves on edge. As he inspected the box, his wife called out from the living room, "There's someone outside." He rushed to the window, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The black SUV was now idling in front of their driveway, its headlights glaring like two unblinking eyes. "Stay inside," he told his family, his voice firm but calm. He stepped outside cautiously, his phone ready to call for help. As he approached the SUV, its engine revved, and it sped off into the night. The next morning, the father called a trusted journalist and shared the latest threats and surveillance. The journalist agreed to help, promising to investigate the broader network behind the hotel chain. A week later, a bombshell article was published, detailing the hotel chain's connections to corrupt officials and illegal dealings. The article went viral, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. But the fight wasn't over. The hotel chain's lawyers filed another lawsuit, this time claiming breach of confidentiality agreements tied to former employees who had spoken out. Meanwhile, the threats against the family escalated. One night, the father received a phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. "You've made a powerful enemy. If you keep going, you'll regret it." The father sat in his study, staring at a growing pile of documents and emails that the journalist had shared with him. Each page revealed more of the tangled web the hotel chain was hiding: tax evasion schemes, connections to offshore accounts, and payments to influential figures in law enforcement and government. He could hardly believe the extent of corruption he was up against, and yet, it fueled his determination. That night, he decided to confront the board of directors head-on. With his lawyer's advice, he sent a public statement to the media, naming names and challenging the board to respond to the allegations. The bold move instantly gained traction online, and the public demanded answers. The backlash was swift. Several board members held a press conference to deny the accusations, branding the father's claims as baseless and defamatory. They painted him as an opportunist trying to tarnish their reputation for personal gain. The narrative began to shift, and doubts crept into the minds of some supporters. The father knew he needed something irrefutable to turn the tide back in their favor. He decided to reach out to a former whistleblower who had previously worked for the hotel chain. The man, a mid-level manager, had been silenced years ago with a hefty settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. It took days of negotiation and assurances of legal protection, but the man finally agreed to talk. They met in a secluded location, where he revealed damning details about the chain's unethical practices. "They'll come after me if they know I've spoken to you," the whistleblower said, his voice trembling. "We'll protect you," the father assured him. With this new information, the father and his lawyer worked tirelessly to compile a detailed exposé. However, before they could release it, disaster struck. One evening, the family returned home to find their front door ajar. Inside, their belongings were overturned, papers strewn everywhere. A message was spray-painted on the living room wall. "Drop it or else." The father immediately called the police, but when they arrived, their response was lackluster. The officers made vague notes, asked a few questions, and left, their indifference palpable. That night, the father sat with his family, grappling with the weight of their fight. His wife, though visibly shaken, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't let them scare us into silence. You always said we should stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Her words reignited his resolve. He decided to take a risk, going live on social media to share their story directly with the public. He revealed the threats, the break-in, and the corruption he had uncovered. His raw, emotional plea struck a chord with viewers, and the video went viral overnight. But the hotel chain wasn't done. The next day, a lawsuit was filed against the father for defamation, seeking to bankrupt him and silence his voice. It felt like a last-ditch effort to crush him, and for a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far. Then, a breakthrough came. The journalist he had been working with called, excitement evident in her voice. "We've got them," she said. "One of their board members is flipping. He's ready to testify against the entire chain. This could bring the whole house of cards down." The father's heart pounded as he realized the tide was turning. But he also knew this was the most dangerous phase yet. The hotel chain would fight tooth and nail to survive, and their desperation could make them even more dangerous. The courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the streets outside as the trial against the hotel chain began. The culmination of months of relentless effort by the father, his lawyer, the journalist, and now the whistleblower. The atmosphere was tense, every eye fixed on the proceedings as the father took the stand to testify. He spoke with conviction, recounting the harassment his family had endured, the corruption he'd uncovered, and the systemic injustices perpetuated by the company. His words carried the weight of not just his own story but of countless others who had been silenced. When the whistleblower took the stand, the room fell silent as he exposed the inner workings of the chain's corrupt empire. His testimony, paired with the mountain of evidence, left the defense scrambling to respond. The turning point came when the flipping board member, under oath, admitted to orchestrating the smear campaigns and intimidation tactics against the father. His confession was the final nail in the coffin, and the courtroom erupted in shock. The judge called for order, but the energy in the room was palpable. The father's persistence had cracked the seemingly impenetrable facade of the hotel chain. In the days that followed, the verdict came. The hotel chain was found guilty of fraud, corruption, and discriminatory practices. Several high-ranking officials faced prison sentences, and the father was awarded damages for the harm caused to his family. But more importantly, the case set a precedent, inspiring other whistleblowers and victims of corporate malfeasance to come forward. With the funds awarded, the father didn't seek revenge or personal luxury. Instead, he invested in transforming the very hotel where they had been refused entry. It became a symbol of equality and hospitality, employing a diverse staff and creating scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing careers in hospitality management. On the opening day of the rebranded hotel, the father stood on the steps with his family, welcoming guests of all races and backgrounds. The journalist who had helped him expose the corruption was there, along with the whistleblower, who now served as an advocate for corporate transparency. It was a moment of triumph and healing. As the father addressed the crowd, he said, "This isn't just about one family or one hotel. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. It's about the power of truth to overcome lies, and the strength we find when we refuse to back down. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The story spread far and wide, not just as a tale of justice, but as a reminder that change is possible when courage and integrity lead the way. Moral of the story: no matter how insurmountable the odds may seem, standing up for what is right can spark change. Integrity, courage, and the willingness to challenge injustice pave the way for a better and fairer world.